it looks like a couple more people are still trickling in, but I'm going to go ahead and get started so that we can stick to the schedule here. I'm Maria Nelson. I'm one of the students who was a part of the AGI Rome immersion trip to Rome in March. We're very excited to have you all here. We just want to take this evening to present kind of what we learned in Rome and to have a discussion about how we can address immigration and refugee-based issues here in the US. Just to give you some context on who we are and what we were doing, we are a team of graduate students from the University of San Francisco that went to Rome to learn about immigration and refugee issues. We spent some time with various organizations as well as in the Vatican, just learning about how these issues affect various different groups of people. We're really eager to share what we've learned with you, and we're grateful to all of you for being here tonight. If you do have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We will have our guest speakers answer those questions after they present, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end as well. If there are any issues as well, if you can't hear anyone or we've got a video about halfway through, if you have trouble hearing the video, please let us know in the chat. We'll get that taken care of. But otherwise, we will go ahead and get started. And we are recording this session, so we will be able to post it afterwards for anyone to see who may have missed it. But I can go ahead and start here. This is our group. This was us in Rome with JRS in the Vatican. And yeah, this is Linda here on the side. Just a little bit of an introduction to our trip. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Arginal. She's a professor in the MIMS program at the University of San Francisco. We're very excited to have her here and for her expertise to share about this topic. So I can turn it over to her. I will stop screen sharing so she can take over. And yeah, we'll go ahead and get started.
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much for the invitation. And I also just want to commend you all for the trip, for going, for engaging, and for continuing the conversation, right? That and being in dialogue around ways that we continue to support migrant communities here. And so I think it's a very important discussion, and just want to commend you all for being there, and then to continue that work, right? Because I think that that's one of the challenges is how do you take that experience from a deep immersion and continue to implement it into your everyday practices. So I'll share. It was really hard to think about what I would share. And so I'm actually going to share a little bit of a journey of my work, but you know, in a 20-minute period. So I'll share my screen. Let me go here. And so, you know, I really am framing this around migrant justice and what does it mean to do this? And I have kind of border and walls as this big, this big center because of the ways in which the experiences of borders and walls are so indicative of what migrant communities face, whether they come with refugee status or as asylum seekers, or folks who are undocumented or without status, folks with DACA, that it's just a world full of borders and walls. And so for me, doing this work, it means thinking about all of the different barriers that come up for families, for communities, for people that have to migrate. And so, you know, a lot of my journey really is looking at the root causes of migration. And so one of those first that kind of create these borders is inequity, right? Global inequity, policies around the world that create situations in which some communities are forced to migrate and have very little support or opportunities or means to do so, and then others that can freely migrate, that have the resources to do so. Then there's these borders and walls around entry, right? And so within the context of the US, I have some listed here that I'll speak about a little bit around metering, MPP, Title 42, Safe Third Country, all of these different terms that create further barriers, you know, these kind of extending of walls to prevent people from actually finding a safe place. And really that's what so many people are looking for, just a safe place to be. Then, on this side, we have criminalization of migrant communities. And what does that look like? It looks like detention and deportations. And then throughout all of this is the ways in which families are kept apart. And so family separation. And so for me in my journey, it has really been stepping up, utilizing the skills that I have and the connections to fight against all of these when I was in a space and where I could, right? And so for me, it's making sure that we see migration in complete ways, and we also see the issues of migration, both from kind of the point, right? What pushes people to migrate, and all of the varied and complex ways that plays out. And then, kind of from the beginning all the way until the end. And what does it mean to be received into a space? What does it mean to be welcomed into community? What does it mean to find home? So I'm going to share a little bit about some of the ways that I've done this work. But before I do, I have to start with some principles of engaging in justice work. And I take these principles from a human rights lawyer that I find profound in his work. He's a human rights lawyer, wrote a book, Just Mercy, the film came out, does work on mass incarceration. And Brian Stevenson has also, identifies as a human rights lawyer, started a memorial, just does really, really profound work. And he has these tenets, these principles of engaging in justice work. And these principles have been really influential in my own journey. I actually got to hear Brian Stevenson speak for the graduation of my doctorate degree. A dear colleague had an extra ticket to an event, and he was the keynote speaker. And he talked about these 4 principles. And this dear friend and colleague of mine and I, we always go back and forth around how we enact and live these. And how we incorporate them into the classroom when we do community engaged research and learning. And so the first he says is you have to get proximate, which means you have to go to spaces where injustice happens. The second, actually, I'm going to change the order a little bit. I'm sorry, and this was his order, but I'm going to change it a little bit. The second is you have to do uncomfortable things, right? So sometimes when you are going into spaces, it is uncomfortable. Maybe we're being pushed or challenged. For me to hear about the role of the United States in kind of the policies that have created the situation for many people to have to migrate, that makes me uncomfortable at the beginning. Now I can talk about it very easily, but sometimes when we get close and are in community, people will challenge us or push us. For me, I often get challenged for representing the university, and I have to, be open and I have to hear that and work with communities. So we have to do uncomfortable things and be in uncomfortable spaces. He also says we have to change the narrative. And so for me, thinking about migration, in particular migration out of Central America, because that's where I do a lot of my work, the narrative of gang violence that's so prevalent, when I visited there, that wasn't what I heard. I heard a lot of other things. And so the work around changing that narrative here on this side, so people understood a more complete picture of why people were migrating, why people were being forced to migrate or felt the need that they had to. And then finally, he says we have to be hopeful. And so all of you, right, this for me is another little moment where I get to feel hopeful that there are people out there that do want to do this work, that want to engage and talk about justice for communities that have to migrate. And so everything that I do, I really come back to these 4 principles, right? Of what am I doing and how am I doing it? How am I being thoughtful about it and intentional, and making sure that I'm holding myself accountable. I also have some of my own guidelines. And so here, these are some of the things that have really grounded the work that I do. And at the center is the relationships that I develop, because these relationships are key, right? I do a lot on methodology, and I think about positionality, but and so I have a reflexive practice, right? So I think about who I am and how I step into spaces, and I'm I can think about what it means to be humble and listen and really challenge myself. Because it is so important that when I step into these spaces, that the relationships that I have are authentic, that I'm listening, that I'm learning, that I'm following the leadership. And so at the core of all of these, you see relationships with those migrating. Then, I kind of go to the box on the right. For me, this journey really started with this idea of speaking to root causes. Going and spending time in Central American countries and listening to communities around why people felt that why people were migrating, right? So it was both organizations and that were on the front lines, but also communities themselves coming and sharing their narratives, partnering with those organizations on the front line. So I don't just show up once and disappear, right? That it is a continuing project, that it is not just listening to those organizations, but a partnership, a relationship. I have to come back, right? When calls come out that, hey, we need this or we need that, I have to show up. The other is the work that I've been able to do has allowed me to follow families. It is, with the relationships. So being in Central America and getting to know communities, folks will reach out and say, hey, my sister is on the journey. What can you do? And it is taking those phone calls. It is rallying folks when I don't know what to do. It is, sending WhatsApp messages to and reaching out to communities that I know are in specific places to see if there's support there. It is, again, making sure that those relationships are maintained. And sometimes it's answering the phone call. Offering an avenue to get the narrative to mainstream media. So I'll talk a little bit about this with some of the Bay Area border relief work that we've done. But, really, when folks were in conditions and the mainstream media wasn't coming there, how did we use our institutional privilege, our connection to academia, to really get these narratives out there? Following the leaderships of those migrating. So right, when we think about who are the real experts, the real experts on migration are the people that migrate. And so how do we listen to them? How do we understand their stories? And how do we learn from them? So these are some of the things that I think are really, really important and have been my own guiding principles. So, I was trying to think about this arc, right? This work from the beginning to the end of understanding root causes to all the way back here in the Bay. And so I'll just share a few. Like I said, I've spent time in Central America. Really, it was the original reason. My family comes from Nicaragua, and so I feel deeply called to continue my relationship, just as my family migrated from Central America. Continuing to understand and remain in community is really a personal connection. And it has led to some really powerful academic work, right? And classes that I've got to teach on investigating root causes of migration. But I was able to go on delegations to Central America. I've spent time in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, getting to know communities and hearing their stories. And, a lot of it was communities talking about the right to remain. So I think one is we have this narrative of migration that everybody wants to come. And many people would like to stay home and are really doing all that they can to fight against large-scale development projects, tourist projects. In Honduras, you have palm oil collectives and mining. You have tourism along the coast, and they wish those would stop so that they could stay home and grow crops and be with their family. And that was really important for me to hear. And so a lot of these projects, I'm part of what's called the Vamos a la Milpa project. It's in solidarity with about 10 human rights and grassroots organizations in Honduras, and where we look at what does it mean to stay home. And then my work has also taken me to the border with Bay Area border relief. We've done a number of service trips to the US-Mexico border, spent time working with families that came out of immigration or actually Border Patrol detention facilities under the Trump administration. And then, the last year was really spent in Mexico with families that had been impacted by the migrant protection protocols, the Remain in Mexico, Title 42, large kind of encampments along the border. And we would go to serve meals, connect with families. And then about 18 of those families, we were able to accompany when the camp was closed under the first years of the Biden administration. We were able to accompany them here to the Bay Area. And so some of that work has continued here, doing summer camps with a lot of the youth from those families. And then finally, here I also continue to remain connected to newcomer communities. And so some of that is accompaniment work. I've been working very closely with one family in particular. I organized neighbors to kind of support, right? We came together to support one family, help find housing and get settled. But I'm also on the board of Refugee and Immigrant Transitions, which is an organization that does education work. I partner a lot with Interfaith Movement for Human Integrity. Recently wrote a blog post. I'm going to be part of the pilgrimage with another one of your group who will be joining me, and we'll attend this pilgrimage looking at immigration detention. And so again, right, it's in each of these, the relationships were centered. And I feel that, you know, in being in Honduras, I got to know a lot of families that were here because folks there were like, oh, you know, my nephew or so-and-so is there. Can you look them up there in the Bay? And so then I was able to come back here and connect and kind of see the needs, you know, and then the opportunity to go and be at the border and really understand, right, why people are migrating, understand what the situation is when they get here. And then also what has been really impactful in my work with Refugee and Immigrant Transitions on the board there is to recognize some of the harm that was done while folks were waiting at the border, right? A lot of health implications, huge gaps in schooling, just, you know, a lot of the pain and trauma that families faced while they were at the border. So yeah, I'm kind of, you know, I have a ton of slides, but I knew that this was going to happen and that I, you know, come to my time within 20 minutes. So I did just want to share, because I think that this is really, really important, because I know you were all in Rome and met with, you know, people who were migrating, many refugees from all over the world. So one of the things that, you know, I really want to remind us is to also really pay attention to the systems, right? Like I sometimes will only hear of the violence, but we're not thinking about what are the situations that allow that violence to occur, right? You know, we see this forced displacement, but it's so interlocking with large systems. And oftentimes, for me, doing work in Central America, a lot of those systems were deeply implicated here. And so I just, you know, this is a semester long course for me to go through all of this, as I have done in my root causes course. But I had to name it because I think that has been really, really important. I'm going to slip. I have, you know, just so much here, but I want to go here also, because these are some questions that I often ask of myself in thinking about this work, right? And again, because I'm here in the US and I do work on Central America, I really think about US policies and what they do to contribute to forced migration. But I think even, you know, in the context of visiting Rome, you could think about Afghanistan and Iraq, Yemen, Syria. You can think of the role of US governments, but also some other powerful countries around the world, and what are their policies that are creating the situation when people feel they have to migrate. And then I really think, you know, for me, this is this question of how can we be co-responsible, right? So what does it mean to welcome? What does it mean to create inclusive spaces? And this is where I'm quite hopeful. So I'm going to end, you know, with two things. I talked a little bit about the Vamos a la Milpa. For me, this is a hopeful project, right? It's one in which we get to partner with communities that are growing, that are thinking about sustainable projects, that are thinking about climate change, that are thinking about land in really powerful ways. And so to follow the leadership, to be part of this is for me part of that. Okay, what is my responsibility in this? And it's something beautiful. And so we go regularly to Honduras. We learn from community organizations, partner with them. And sometimes it is through struggle, right? Sometimes one of the communities we partnered with, Wapinol, it was a long-term struggle around the release of political prisoners and the defense of their river. And other times it's growing crops. And what does that mean? And how is that celebrated? And then finally, I know that I'm going to end also in kind of some of the spaces of hope here in the Bay, because I think that this is also something you're all looking for. And I just think about the ways in which in the Bay Area, we've thought a lot about being there and organizations showing up. So Oakland OUSD actually has an office that deals with newcomer and refugee students and their families. Interfaith Movement for Human Integrity is looking at immigration detention. ALAS, doing these amazing summer camps, working with families of mixed status, organizations that provide legal aid. And so I'm really hopeful. And I think that all of you, as you're looking for spaces to stay involved, I think that you'll find a ton of them here in the Bay. And we're in a really great place to do so. And I do see that families, it's hard to navigate this, but with a supportive community around them, they can find that space and hope. And if we all step up, right, I think we do create a space in which migrant communities, newcomer families, refugees can be welcomed in and can find the support and services that are needed to help build a new home here. So I will end there for my 20 minutes, and I think that it's time for question and answers.
Yes, Dr. Arginal, thank you. We've got a couple of questions in the chat. I will just read them to you if that's all right.
Sure.
And have this conversation. The first one is that we've noticed that Ukrainian migrants are being treated differently than migrants of other backgrounds. Can you speak to the mindset and policy shifts that we're currently seeing?
Yeah. So first thing I want to say is what's happening in Ukraine actually shows that the media can get it right if they wanted to. Right? So the way in which the media can talk about Ukrainian refugees is the media can get it right? If they want to. And so it's in that way, it's like, okay, hey, you've just shown us that you can do this. The work that is taking place on the Polish border, right? With people being there with signs, greeting families, so we know what needs to be done, and we can see that people can do it if they want to. And so now it's just that holding governments accountable, because when they say they can't, we've seen that they can, right? What the Ukrainian refugees are receiving is exactly what they should be receiving, as should refugees and people who are forced to migrate should also, right? So that for me is the first thing that's really, really important, is that this is a model of what we can do if there is a will. The other thing for me, in which I have appreciated, because I've also been in partnership with some Yemeni activists on the war in Yemen, is the ability for this to highlight the hypocrisy of the US, France, and the UK. So while we're sitting here, really going in about sanctions for what is taking place for the bombing of Ukraine, as we should be, we then need to turn in and look at our own policies of the ways in which the US, France, and the UK bomb Yemen, because it is with our aid to Saudi Arabia, it is with our military supplies, logistical support in which Yemen is being bombed. And so, and again, I've heard folks, I just listened the other day to, I think it was the foreign from Cuba, talking about why countries in the global South, kind of around the world are not willing to condemn, and they talk about this hypocrisy. And so it is so blatantly clear that we're starting to see it again in the media. And the War Powers Act is probably going to be introduced into Congress again, which means that the government, the administration, cannot send weapons to Saudi Arabia without the support of Congress, without the approval of Congress. If we can get this passed, then hopefully maybe we can see a little bit of relief for the Yemeni people, because they are unable to migrate in the same ways that the Ukrainians can, because their borders are closed. It's right. It's a more dangerous migration situation for them. Many go to Djibouti and then are stuck there. Many, under the Trump administration, went to Djibouti, could not get visas, even though many had U.S. like a family member had a U.S. passport. They could not get visas to come to the U.S. to flee what we know is one of the worst humanitarian situations in the world right now. So these are for me kind of, I could go on, but these are the two that I really pull from with Ukraine. Is number one, we can get it right because we're seeing it done as it should be. How do we then apply that to places like Ethiopia, to places like Yemen, like where we see large scale conflict? How do we support those communities that are forced to migrate? And then also hold ourselves accountable to the Refugee Convention around what are durable solutions. And in Yemen, it's an easy one because it actually is the US, the UK, and France that have the ability to stop sending weapons to Saudi Arabia. Simple as that, right? Like, this is an easy one for me. So I'll leave it there before, so I don't take up two, but those are two really clear kind of ways in which I see Ukraine.
Thank you. I
Yeah.
appreciate the hopefulness of that. I think for a lot of us, it's very hopeless to see the discrepancy here, but I appreciate you reframing that for us. I've got another question. You alluded to it a little bit already, but what potential US policy change would be the most impactful to help migrants who wish to remain in their home countries?
Yeah. We need to just stay out of their business. It's easy to say in the case of Honduras, right? Like, we were deeply implicated in the 2009 coup. Like, we supported that, right? Fraudulent elections in 2017, the Trump administration signed off the day after. So some of the easy one is just stay out. But it's interesting because this is where there's this line of kind of transnational corporations, big business, and then the role of the US government. And so I'm going to cite Representative Ilhan Omar. There is this mining project that is happening in Honduras. Indigenous community, Lencan community is resisting heavily. And Ilhan Omar pulled out some of our own development aid guidelines that says you must seek consent from the community before a development project can be supported. And so I think, right, I'll see if I can find the reporting on it. It was brilliant. So she went to Congress and was like, we can't support this. This is in violation of our own policy. We actually do have some policies that are out there that if we could just follow. And these are some of the large scale developments. So like funded by the US government. I work with the community in Guapino. Their project is private industry, right? But our charge d'affaires of the United States was pictured photographed with the owner of this mining project, 4 days into a trial of 8 political prisoners because of this project. So I think that the US could either stay out of some of the spaces it doesn't need to be supporting, or really go by its own policies in terms of development projects. So that's kind of the large foreign policy stuff, because really a lot of large scale development projects do lead to what will go from rural to urban migration, and then the urban migration to the US, right? So families get pushed off their land in rural spaces, have to migrate into urban areas, San Pedro Sula, Tegucigalpa, often in really vulnerable living situations, right? Where we do then see the gang violence and some of that happening, and then forced to migrate into the US. But if they could stay in those original spaces, it's really, really important. And many folks do want to stay and are actively struggling to do that. So we call kind of the right to remain. Yeah.
Thank you.
Those are great questions.
Yeah, they are. I've got one last question for you.
Sure.
So it sounds like you work both with immigrants directly and in academia. How would you describe the relationship between these two areas of work?
That is a long answer. For me, I really do see I think I come from community and have found a home in academia, right? I wouldn't say the opposite, right? Like, I really do this work and engaged in educational spaces because of my community work, right? Because I see how important it is, the ways in which theories have helped inform my community work. And so that bridging is really, really important for me. And I also, because MIMS, I sit in this program that is around working with the future generation of folks that are going to be doing this work. It's a really joyful place to be in that bridging, right? How do we connect students to community work? How do we understand and listen to those narratives? How do we co-create knowledge together? So that's a beautiful space, but there are tensions, right? And there's a lot of, barriers for folks to engage. So I will share that mine, I think with MIMS, we really try to honor the work of communities that are working with migrant communities and connecting students to those spaces.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for your time.
You're
That
welcome.
was a
Thank
really
you.
insightful presentation. I know it's really hard to sum up everything in 10 minutes, but we really appreciate you being here with us this evening. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your participation.
Thank
I'm
you.
gonna screen share again and then go ahead and introduce our next presenter. This is Dr. Gioli from the International Studies program. She's here to speak to us about her experience working with migrants and with immigration, these social movements behind immigration. We're really grateful to have her here. Dr. G, I think you have your own slides if you'd like me to turn over screen sharing privileges. All right,
Yes, thank you.
stop sharing. The floor is yours.
I think I already have them. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for inviting me today. It's really an honor to be part of this conversation, and it's, I'm also happy to sort of come in and speak to people who have been in Italy and learned about the context there, which is where I'm from, where I do my research, and I come at this, as someone that has really, a deep commitment to make, the place I'm from, Italy and Europe more generally, a place that is welcoming towards migrants and refugees, as well as the US and the spaces that I'm in right now. So I'll be talking today about some work that's happening both mainly in the Italian context, but also with some counterparts in the US. So let me share my screen. Okay. Okay, perfect. So there we go. So, I come to this, really come to this work, really, recognizing that we're right now in a moment of, global border fortification around the world. We see really a kind of closing both of material borders, but also of symbolic borders of the nation, right, with a kind of rise of exclusionary forms of nationalism. And, I'm sure that you're familiar with some of these questions, but as you can see here, this is a graph that was created by a professor at the University of Montreal a few years ago that really shows the rise in border walls around the world from the 40s till today. And we can really see that, while there was this idea in the 90s that we're going towards a world without borders, where people would eventually be able to travel around the world without any limitations, this has hardly been the case, right? And if anything, we've seen a hardening of borders worldwide. And, this happens both through the actual construction of border walls, and the image that you see on the bottom right, it looks very similar to the US-Mexico border, but this is actually the Spanish enclave of Ceuta in Morocco, or also through a kind of just general, surveillance of maritime borders. And the image that you can see on the top right of the screen is from a project called Forensic Oceanography that monitors violence against migrants in the Mediterranean. And it basically shows how the stretch of sea between, actually specifically here, it's between Tunisia and Italy, has become, increasingly surveilled and fortified, and is also the site, as I'll mention in a moment, of a lot of, migrant deaths and shipwrecks of migrant vessels. So, one of the things that has really happened, in this broader context of border fortification is, of course, the actual hardening of borders, but also what's sometimes called in the US context, a process of prevention through deterrence, which basically means essentially pushing migrants to attempt to cross the border in areas that are particularly dangerous. In other words, by sort of fortifying the urban border areas in the US-Mexico border, migrants have increasingly been going through the Sonoran Desert and Arizona in the US, which is a very dangerous area to cross the border. It's very difficult to cross on foot. There's a high risk of dehydration. And you can see something similar in the context of Europe as well. So since the mid 1990s, right, when it became sort of visa requirements for a lot of European countries became more stringent, you saw increasingly attempts of migrants to cross the Mediterranean, which once again is a very dangerous endeavor. And these strategies, of course, these kind of dangerous border crossings affect all migrants, but I think it's particularly significant, with regards to the right to asylum and the ability for people to claim asylum, right? Because countries that have signed the 1951 convention most of the world has really agreed on the principle of non-refoulement, right? So basically, if people arrive, if someone that's seeking asylum arrives into a territory of the country they want to claim asylum in, they cannot be sent back and they cannot be deported until their case has been heard. But essentially, these forms of border control, which prevent people from actually entering the territory of the state they want to claim asylum in, effectively prevent this right for many people. So of course, these kinds of systems of border fortification have had substantial effects. So specifically, they've essentially made border crossings extremely dangerous, right? This is a map created by the International Organization for Migration, Missing Migrants Project, which shows the migrants that are missing in various different border crossings around the world. And as you can see here, the Mediterranean Sea is by far the most dangerous site of border crossing globally. But of course, the US-Mexico border is also the same. And so I think, seeing this situation, something that a lot of activists have been asking themselves, in Europe, where I'm more familiar with, but also in the US, is, what can we do, right? What can we do, if nothing else, to address this issue of, of the violence that borders do on the bodies of people who are trying to cross them, right? How can we prevent borders from becoming sites of migrant disappearance and death? So for a long time, there have been organizations in the context of Europe specifically, who have been doing the work of essentially documenting what's happening at borders, right? So the idea is, let's raise awareness, let's show what's occurring. So in the Mediterranean specifically, there's an organization called Watch the Med that has been documenting the disappearance and deaths of migrants, with the idea that, if you make people aware of this in the general public, also in the political sphere, in national level and the European level, that will lead to some kind of change. On the US-Mexico border, there's an organization that has also been doing similar work. It's called the Colibri Center for Human Rights. And they essentially do forensic work to help identify migrants who have died at borders, and thus also help families, get closure to, after, looking for the people, members of their family who have disappeared while attempting to migrate. So these kinds of efforts, however, particularly in the European space, there's been a sort of growing unease of, how, of course, we're doing awareness raising, we're showing what's happening at borders, but can we intervene more directly? Can we actually prevent deaths that happen at borders? Can we make border crossing more safe? And in this context, there have been two main types of organizations that have really emerged in Europe, both of whom are attempting to essentially prevent the shipwrecks of migrant vessels attempting to cross the Mediterranean and provide assistance to them. So the first type is really essentially tries to create an additional sort of alarm network for migrant boats that are stranded at sea. And this really came out originally of the work of an Eritrean priest in the Vatican, who was sort of the emergency contact for Eritreans who are attempting to cross the Mediterranean. And it was an emergency number that the people would sometimes contact if they were stranded at sea, if they were not being assisted by any European Coast Guard or other vessels. There was an infamous case in 2013 when a boat was left adrift for 10 days. And despite having contacted Italian and Maltese Coast Guards and have been cited by a series of commercial vessels. And so essentially the idea was that someone who is in Europe can put pressure on the Coast Guard, can create a public case essentially for these boats to be assisted. And inspired by this effort, in 2013, the Watch the Med alarm phone organization was created. And this is, you can see their logo on the bottom left of the screen. And this is essentially a transnational network of activists located in Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, who man an emergency phone line for migrants stranded at sea. And when they're called or contacted via WhatsApp, they also mobilize and push national coast guards to intervene. However, these are really to some extent limited efforts, because they really rely on on publicizing cases and on pushing the Coast Guard to intervene. So starting in 2015, a series of organizations, some larger institutional NGOs and smaller groups of activists that sort of came together to create organizations for this scope, started organizing their own search and rescue operations in the Mediterranean. And essentially, from all these different organizations have boats that are self-funded, not funded by national governments, that essentially patrol the Mediterranean to provide assistance to migrants stranded at sea. Now, of course, this in the U.S.-Mexico border, it's a different context, but there's also been a series of attempts to provide this kind of direct assistance, humanitarian assistance, to prevent, the kind of the dangers that exist in crossing the border. Which, I mean, there are many, but dehydration is a major one. So here there have been a series of organizations, and these are just two examples, that have been conducting water drops for migrants crossing the Sonoran Desert, which is essentially leaving water out in areas where we know that they're sort of sites of common border crossing. And one thing I wanted to mention, for people who are interested in getting involved, is that both of these organizations are always looking for volunteers. And of course, all of these organizations are always could use support. Now, one thing I want to mention, and I think it's particularly important in the context of, I mean, I know I'm more familiar with the context of the Mediterranean, but I think they're good considerations in general, is that all of these organizations really frame their work as solidarity, right? They see themselves as part of a co-struggle with migrants for freedom of movement. And some of them really consider themselves as part of a long tradition in standing in solidarity with the oppressed, but also of sort of tying themselves back to, for example, the work of the Underground Railroad used to do, right? So really part of this broader solidarity movement. But one important thing to mention is that there's often the risk of being criminalized for doing this type of activity, right? Because both in the US context and in multiple European countries, assisting migrants in crossing the border is something that can be, you could be accused of smuggling for doing this kind of work. And these are just two news headlines that I wanted to point to that refer to a case in the US for the No More Deaths organization, and a case in Italy for one of the search and rescue boats, where essentially these activists were accused of transporting migrants across the border, and were thus had to go through a whole court process. Now, in both of these contexts, the activists were acquitted of smuggling. They argued that they were providing humanitarian, they were doing humanitarian work, and that this, that you cannot criminalize this type of activity. But of course, this did create some kind of a chilling effect, right? Nonetheless, all of these organizations, continue to do this very important work. Now, having said this, I want to take a step back and talk more generally, though, about what we can do and what I think is fundamental to do, in beyond this kind of very important, right, direct work on the ground, of course, to make border crossing more safe. And this has to do, once again, with this question of we're living in a moment of fortified borders that are not just the material borders, but are also the symbolic borders of a nation, right? We're really globally living a moment of heightened nationalism. And in this sense, I think we really have to talk about how can we, open up and broaden the symbolic borders of a nation as well. So I'm going to talk specifically, from the context of Italy that I'm more familiar with, but I think there's some important counterparts also in the United States. So, I think in the context of Italy, really the borders of the nation are also closed with regards to, legally, right, with regards to access to citizenship. Now, many European countries, Italy included, do not have birthright citizenship. You're not a citizen by virtue of having been born in the territory, right? But mainly by descent. So this means that there are people that have been born in the country and have lived there, all their lives, who still don't have citizenship, and in some cases are still dependent on, short-term residency permits. So this is essentially people who are in the country, who are of the country, who've spent their entire lives there, and who are still excluded in this way. And of course, the US is different. But I think, I see many parallels in terms of people who are undocumented and have been undocumented for years and are still, excluded. So I think that one thing that has to happen, and one way that we should all get involved, is really advocate for the kinds of legal reforms that can, allow for full inclusion into the national community. But I think that we also have to really push for expanded understandings of who belongs, right, and who is part of the space. And one thing that occurs in Europe is, I think, really the mainstream discourses around migration, both by opponents of it, but also quite often by people who are, in favor of migrant rights, who want safe crossings of the Mediterranean. But it's still this sort of assumption that, migrants are people, are external people coming from outside who will change a supposedly homogeneous national community. And what I do with my own research, and what I think is really important for people to understand, is that we really have to show how is the national community itself constructed, right? We know how in the US context, for example, the national community was created historically through processes of exclusion. I'm thinking about the history, right, of genocide of Native Americans, history of dispossession of Hispanos in the Southwest, histories of enslavement. And in Europe as well, right, sort of symbolic boundaries of Europe itself, or of individual nation states, many were really formed in colonial context, right, by marking a division between who was a citizen, a European citizen, and who was a colonial subject. And so in that sense, I think showing this kind of history allows us to maybe take a step away from really considering, national boundaries as a given, understanding the kind of often violent histories that went into their creation. And at the same time, I think it's also important to show how definitions of who belong in a nation have changed over time. And I'm thinking, in the context of Italy or other European countries, there are populations of the internal peripheries that for a long time were racialized as external others, right? And then were included into the nation. And so in that sense, there's nothing natural about our current borders, and they can be changed, our symbolic borders as well as our material ones. And this leads me to, make one more observation, which is, I think we should also think in broader terms, if we're involved in very, on the ground type of work in favor of migrant rights, in favor of safe passage across borders, I think we should always always remember, the broader aspirational questions and broader issues around movement. And I think the question we need to pose ourselves from a moral perspective really is why socially, right? Why do we generally accept limitations to freedom of movement according to nationality, right? And, of course, freedom of movement itself, to some extent, is even enshrined in the UN Declaration for Human Rights in terms of internal movement, right, within the nation state, or the freedom to leave the country, not necessarily freedom to enter any country. But I think really on moral grounds, why do we accept that people should have different rights to cross borders according to what passport they hold, when we would consider a similar distinction along lines, for instance, of race, gender, or ethnicity to be morally unacceptable? As the previous speaker mentioned as well, right, we live in a world that's characterized today by very profound inequalities, which are upheld by borders, right? The places where you're born and the citizenship that you hold determine your opportunities in life at best. And at worst, right, the places where you're born or your citizenship can make you into someone that needs to seek protection somewhere else, into a forced migrant. And so in this sense, I think that while we're doing the important work, in terms of standing in solidarity with migrants and refugees, in providing safe passage and preventing deaths at borders, we need to fight for the right of movement and of non-refoulement for refugees, right? Allowing them and providing paths to claim asylum that do not involve crossing the Mediterranean on a makeshift vessel, but also more broadly think about, right, the moral grounds on which we do limit the freedom of movement for some people, and really think about what it would take to give this kind of right to access to equal opportunity for everyone. So with this, I'm going to conclude my presentation part of this, and I very much look forward to talking more with all of you about these questions.
Great, thank you so much. It looks like there are a couple of questions in the chat. I will start with those. And if anyone else has questions, please feel free to put them into the chat. The first one is about Australia. Evidently, they have a very strict policy of not rescuing or allowing migrants in via boat. In part, this person believes to reduce risky sea travel. Do you think that this policy has any merit, or is it misguided, or how do you feel about this policy?
Right. I think it's interesting that that we see similar processes in various maritime borders. Actually, Australia's and there's a lot of dialogue between these different sites. Australia's policy actually comes from a policy that was in place in the U.S. in the 90s around migration from Cuba and Haiti, right? And so a lot of these processes of like not allowing people to actually enter national territory to claim asylum, to sort of trying to stop border crossings. You can see very similar things happening in the Caribbean, in Australia, and in the Mediterranean. The idea that not allowing people, basically preventing people from leaving, is a form of protecting them. I would argue that it depends, forcing people to stay in places where their life in danger is not a way of protecting them, right? So I think, this is a debate. I'm less familiar with the Australian context, but in the context of Europe, there's been a discussion of, we need to basically stop border crossings to save the rights, save lives. But this has meant sometimes, for example, keeping sub-Saharan migrants in Libya in places where there are profound violations of their human rights, well documented by many different international organizations. So I think what we need to talk about if we want to provide safety for people is give avenues for people to migrate and to claim asylum, but don't require them undertaking these risks.
Thank you. I have another question from one of our group members, someone who came to Italy with us. She's asking about the experience of undocumented migrants in Italy. What does the social infrastructure look like for someone who's undocumented in Italy in terms of access to services and social integration?
Right. Yeah, this is a good question. I think, differently from the US, in Italy, there have been historically and even more recently more occasions for regularizing people's statuses. So, while in the US it's been since the 80s that there's really been a sort of mass. I mean, there have been some instances like DACA, but it's been since the 80s that there's been a mass opportunity for people to change their status. In Italy, there have been more occasions, and also it's in a way more, I would say, for if you have a family member who's a citizen or children, there are many more ways in which there are policies to keep families together in a way that's not the case in the US. Having said this, I would argue it's harder to access certain types of services as an undocumented person in Italy than it is, at least in California. I don't want to talk about the US as a whole. I was, previously in a different state, and I can say it looks very different, right, according to where you are. But for example, it's very difficult to access things like a driver's license or those kinds of the basic or having avenues of employment that are not under the table. It's very difficult there as someone who's undocumented. So I think it depends. On some areas, I think it's easier than the US, and in some areas it's more complicated.
Thank you. I have one last question for you, unless anyone else has another one in the chat. Would you agree with having open borders at a worldwide scale? How would that be possible or not from your perspective?
Wow, this is I would love to teach, talk about this for a long, one of those for probably months or years. So yeah, I think there are many ways of coming from this. I think from a moral perspective, yes, I think we should have open borders. And I think if there is not justification to limit the right of movement according to nationality. I think of how that would happen, what it would entail. I think it's sometimes helpful to look to places where there was a removal of borders and look at what happened. I mean, look at what happened in the European Union, for instance, with freedom of movement, right, internally. And there were countries there that had there were substantial inequalities in income levels between countries, specifically with Southern Europe and then Eastern Europe. So I think that gives us, one idea. They're regional. In West Africa, there are sort of areas of relative freedom of movement and circulation. So I think we can look to, some regional examples of what that could look like. Of course, there are broader questions of disparities in income and would those level out over time. And there's a lot to talk about, but there's One thing I can recommend, if people are interested in looking into this further, there's a really interesting book that came out precisely addressing all these questions. It's edited by a geographer called Rhys Jones, and I'm happy to share the resource there. I think that's really food for thought on, what would that look like, and what would it be possible, and how would all sorts of questions of, inequality internally, transnationally be addressed, workers' rights, et cetera. I would love to talk about this more, but as I said, it would take, 25 minutes to give a very short answer to this.
It would take months. Thank you. And thank you for being here and for taking the time and for gracing us with your expertise. It's been a pleasure. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again and introduce our next speaker, who unfortunately is not able to be here in person. And so we pre-recorded a session with him that I'll go ahead and play for you all in just a moment here. But this is Dr. Hing. He is a professor of immigration law in both the international studies and the law school at USF. He's also an immigration attorney himself. He has decades of experience and has published several publications, articles, and books. He's also the director of the Immigration and Deportation Defense Clinic, has a very impressive career and very impressive background. And we're very grateful that he took the time to speak with one of our team members, even though he couldn't be here with us this evening. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the video here. If you are not able to hear it, please let me know, either in the chat, raise your hand, whatever you need to do. But let's go ahead and jump in here.
Well, we are with Professor Bill Hing. He is an immigration attorney. He has extensive experience working on immigration cases. He has several publications on the topic, and he currently works with the Immigration and Deportation Defense Clinic here at USF. So we are very pleased to have him in this event, and thank you very much for accompanying us at the USF4Freedom event, Professor Hing.
Thank you. And I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but I'm teaching tonight. Thank you.
Well, we'll ask just 3 questions. The first one is, could you describe the job that the Immigration and Deportation Defense Clinic does?
Represent right now over 500 cases of individuals, mostly from Central America, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, and also from Mexico as well, who are asylum seekers. And I would say that almost half of the caseload are unaccompanied minors who have fled gang violence and cartel violence. And then the other half is many women with their children who have fled domestic violence. And so we are helping all of them apply for asylum or protection.
Thank you. What are the tenets that characterize the work that the clinic does with immigrants?
That's such an important question. Well, of course, first of all, we want to do the best we can to get protections under the immigration laws for these. But we also want to be extremely careful and sensitive to the trauma that all of our clients have suffered. I said they are fleeing violence countries, and we are very cautious and careful about the effect of trauma on them. And many of them have also suffered additional trauma in traveling to the United States. Some of them have suffered many incidents of trauma in their home countries, but also along the way. And so that's an important one of our tenets, is to what they've endured while gathering enough information to, of course, a very strong case on their behalf, but protecting them from not experiencing more trauma than is necessary.
How do those tenets are put in practice in the daily work that you do at the clinic?
Well, one thing, the clients are very special to us. We are not subjects. They are individuals. Our utmost respect and our utmost care, and of course, our strongest ability to advocate on their behalf. Treat them
Sorry, can
as
you
if,
repeat the last phrase? Something happened with the audio.
right. These clients are very special to us, and we treat them with great care because of the trauma that they've endured. So of course, we treat them with strong confidentiality. And while we do have students working on some of the cases, the clients only meet one student and one lawyer, and maybe sometimes one paralegal, but we do not send them from one student to another attorney. They just have that one team, and it's because we don't want the clients to be treated like they are a subject, like they're being scrutinized, and we value what they've struggled through. And so, for example, some organizations might want to have a lot of publicity over their clients during the case or after the case. But we don't do that because we know that what the clients have gone through is so traumatizing that we feel that it's much more respectful of them to just be very confidential and keep that confidence. Now, yes, there may be times when a client so excited and wants to share what happened with them, but occasionally we'll do it with the media, but usually not. Usually it's with other clients, because, and again, this usually doesn't happen, but we might have a client who wants to counsel other clients to assure them, to let them know what they went through, and to try to ease the other client's mind. But again, even that's unusual because of the privacy. So that's the chief manifestation of our philosophy, is maintaining the dignity and the privacy of the individuals, because and these are not subjects to study. These individuals who deserve human treatment and dignity.
Well, thank you so much. I know the work that you're doing is really important and is vital for many people. So thank you so much for that, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for the opportunity and the invitation. Thanks.
Well,
Alrighty, thank you to Linda for facilitating this conversation with Dr. Hing, and please pass our thanks on to him as well. I am going to pass it over, I believe, to Joanna next. Sorry, I'm stuck in full screen mode.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so hello everyone. I am a graduate student in the International Studies program. there at the University of San Francisco. So just some of my interest, my academic interest, I'm doing a thesis on the concepts of gender and race in the in migration. Particularly, I'm looking at the case of Haitian migrants at the US-Mexico border. I was very lucky to be with all the other 11 students. We were all very lucky to participate in the Rome program that culminated to this conference that we organized. It was a very fruitful experience because, as was mentioned by Maria, we all come from different programs. So we were able to bring in different perspectives and skills and insights. Some of the things that we did in Rome, we met with various organizations that assist migrants and refugees in different ways in their migrant trajectory, which does not end when they arrive in the host country in Italy, where we were. Some of the organizations that we visited were Jesuit Refugee Services, which work with integration, Centro Astali, that offers food, shelter, and other services. We were at the dicastery section for refugees and migrants at the Vatican. We heard presentations from humanitarian corridors, university corridors, speakers from UNHCR and Save for Children. So as you can imagine, it was a very intense week of a lot of learning. I want to emphasize that more than learning about the migration crisis, which is something that we are constantly, because we participated in the program, we are students that are interested in this topic. But most importantly, since we were already conscious that violations exist, and that we were conscious that there is discrimination at the US-Mexico border, and that there are policies in place that make some refugee groups and migrants more vulnerable than others. So we had that in mind, but we went to Italy and we learned how migration cooperation networks and organizations work with each other in order to assist these, which I think is a very important point to make, because migration management strategies and networks and how a different country is responding to this humanitarian crisis that is occurring. We saw the context of Italy, and we can come back and bring that experiential learning experience to the Bay Area where we reside. But that was the most important part of the trip, I think, for most of us, is learning how to build those relationships that Dr. Amy Arginal had mentioned earlier, outreach and building those relationships. So being able to see how migration advocacy occurs there in a different country, and how Italy is receiving people that are also fleeing from political instability, natural disasters, or war, or economic depravity, and putting into perspective how the United States is responding to that. So Dr. Amy Arginal, you mentioned hope, and that's one of the things that we also mentioned in our time in Italy, is how in discussion with the Ukrainian refugee flow, I think it's over 1 million now, how this could be a paradigm shift, right, of how we treat refugees. After the program, I was doing field work at the US-Mexico border, and that's one of the things that came into perspective for me, is how quickly communities and the government can mobilize for action. So yes, we're all looking for places to, because we have this perspective now and seeing how it's possible, not only seeing with the Ukrainian refugees, but also what we saw in Rome, how we can look for places to stay involved, and how we can use our individual skills or our fields, our work to advocate for migrants and refugees. So I want to share some photographs for some photos that we took, so students can see how we were. Will stop sharing? Do you want to continue? Yes. Okay. Yes. Can you see this?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Okay, so this is us at the Jesuit Refugee Services. Here we are, Pendrastali, where we were able to speak to a person with refugee experience, Antegidio, the castery for the section for human rights, migrants and refugee rights, Casa Scalabrini. Also visited a hospital where there is a project for assisting refugees and migrants, advocating for their health rights. And there we are. So yeah, I just want to mention that the program is an excellent model for USF, because it's a way that makes possible what the university stands for. And so stop sharing here. Okay, so if anybody has any questions to any of the students that participated in the program or myself. Oh, and Casey just mentioned that we made a list of the experts and organizations. It's on the chat if you want to see.
Great, thank you, Joanna. I'm going to pass it over to Erica. If anyone does have questions for any of the student participants, please feel free to put them in the chat. We're happy to address them at the end of the presentation here. But I will pass it over to Erica to talk about her experience. And yeah, thank you, Joanna, for sharing yours.
Thank you both. My name is Erica Amalfabon Alvarez, and I'm a graduate student with the master's at the School of Management. I am graduating in a month with my master's in organizational development, change management and development. It has always been a huge interest in for me, and I am an immigrant. So I came here to the United States from Mexico when I was 13 years old, and I think my personal experience has impacted the things that I'm passionate about and where I am today. Currently, I work as an operations manager at a small nonprofit organization in Northern Sonoma County. And this organization focuses on supporting the immigrant and refugee community in a small affluent town and the surrounding areas of the county. And a lot of our clients are immigrants and refugees. We provide a lot of different services, and the main reason why I am there and why I decided to earn this degree was because I want to support those systems that we have to support the minorities and those who are not heard or seen typically, or are ignored. My experience at the AGI Rome program, as Johanna mentioned, we went to so many organizations where we learned so much, and we were able, what I really cherished of the experience was that we were able to bring 11 students, 10 students, 11 students that have so many different backgrounds and interests and work in different areas. And we all found ourselves in this kind of common ground, focusing on the importance of human rights for immigrants and refugees, and what this crisis, the ripple effect that this crisis has for everyone. One of the things that I was really interested on was the management of these organizations that we visited. The organizations are amazing. They provide a lot of rapid response for each individual. And what I really thought was really great about all of them, regardless of what their main focus was that they would see the person as a whole. It wasn't just an Italian language school where people came to an hour long class and learned how to get by with Italian, but it was a language school where they found emotional support, where they found connection to other resources that they needed. Also, they kind of like created these like long-term meaningful connections with the staff members, and a lot of the refugees that participated in these programs would come back and support other refugees that had just arrived in Italy, and sort of created the support system that goes beyond the service that the organization provides. So it really changed my perspective. Also knowing that the majority of these organizations are funded by individuals. They're not receiving government money or tax money necessarily. Italy, from what I gathered, Italy's kind of hands off, right? They just sort of provide the accessibility for people to like apply for a permit to live there, and an ID, and those essential services like that, but they are not like funding organizations to support immigrants and refugees. But the people there are more welcoming than what I have experienced here in the US and in Mexico as well. The other thing is sort of the barriers that we have here in the US compared to the barriers for the accessibility of these essential services like language, for example. Here in the US, one of the big things that I've noticed is that there are very few English language schools, and they are not as supportive. Classes are not as accessible. If you decide to go to a community college to try to learn English, the process to even just register for the class is really tedious. And I've known that from personal experience, helping my parents, helping family members, friends as well, to like sign up for a class at the junior college. It's all of these kind of support systems have a lot of barriers for immigrants and refugees to access them. So compared to our experience there in Italy, those services are kind of readily available for those who need them. The other thing that I noticed a big difference in perspective was, growing up as the southern neighbor to the US, it's thought that the US is kind of like the North Star for all refugees and migrants, right? Obviously, Latin American migrants and refugees typically will come to the US because that is the easiest, quote unquote, journey to make, to a country where they feel like they have some better opportunity. But once we were in Italy, and this was my first time traveling outside of Mexico or the US, I realized that we are not kind of like the ideal goal for anyone fleeing their situation in their home country. So we definitely put a lot more intentional barriers for refugees and migrants. And that was something that was not necessarily surprising, but kind of like really shocking and hurtful to realize once we were in Italy, because the sort of anti-immigrant and anti-refugee sentiment is a lot stronger here. What else? The thing I also notice is that a lot of the organizations in Italy that we visited, if not all, are faith-based. And something that I have been thinking about since we were there and since is sort of, I grew up as a practicing Catholic, and being there just really like resonated with me, going to these organizations that sort of come or have been founded by those like Christian values was something that just made sense to me. But then I also realized that all these values are sort of the core values for all kinds of religions, right? So then I started thinking about, what is it really? It's not necessarily the specific religion or the faith values that you grow up with, but it's kind of these like core values that we all hold as a human being, right? So sort of like human dignity and compassion for all, and seeing the person in front of you not as a label of this person's a refugee, or this person is an immigrant, they're not from here, or they're not, just instead of seeing those differences in those labels, seeing the other person in front of you as another human being just like you. It can be, you can see them as your sister, your brother, your friend, your family member, because they are human just like us, right? And there's this idea of like, immigrants and refugees are not like us. And in a lot of places, in order for governments in different countries to not want to share their wealth and not want to support those coming from tough situations in other countries, and really othering the people that have had to make this journey. And another thing that I really thought about was just reminding myself of like, these people did not want to leave their home country. They did not want to leave their family members, but they had to. And now they're trying to survive, and sort of like the difference between some countries putting a lot of barriers in that survival in order for people to prevent people from coming here to the US or countries that just have really strong anti-refugee and immigrant sentiments. And so just kind of that dehumanization, I can't say that word all right now, is used strategically to not allow, to kind of prevent people from coming over. A couple things that I have been thinking about and will continue to think about after this experience in Rome, it was sort of like, how do we hold ourselves accountable as an individual, at an individual level, on the day-to-day things that we practice, that the things that we consume, where we spend our money, sort of how do we support organizations locally to provide these services for people who need it, right? So how can I somehow support an organization or a place to provide English classes for people after work, because most people won't take, they need to survive, so they'll have to work. How do we provide classes and support for people at an available time for them? Another thing is kind of like the advocacy for fair and accessible status for refugees. How can we continue to push the government here and anywhere else to make these processes available to them and not have all these barriers for them to receive this status? And also the advocacy for legal reform for residency and citizenship of people who have been here for a really long time and continue to be criminalized and punished for decisions that either were made for them. For example, a lot of DACA recipients, right? They came here with their parents, they had no say, but also the parents had a reason to come here. So how do we decriminalize that search for a better opportunity for themselves and their families? So those are kind of some thoughts of like, how do I bring everything that I learned through these organizations and this experience back to where I can make a change and create a ripple effect and affect change at a larger scale. Lastly, I want to thank Dr. Marco Tavanti, who has been amazing at putting this together, and all his hard work and dedication on taking us. And after 2 years of a pandemic, finally making this trip happen for us, and hopefully continue to make it happen for a lot of other students who are interested in this subject. As well as Dr. Chiara Perry, who was our magical connection between USF and Dr. Tabanti with all and us with the amazing organizations that we got to visit and the people that we got to meet and get knowledge from, and who hosted us and allowed us into their spaces, which was a really amazing thing. And lastly, Mariah O'Grady, I'm hoping that I'm not butchering your last name, but who supported us through the trip by providing us emotional support, coordination, and more for the week that we were there. So thank you all so much, and thank you to the students and the panelists that are here that have put so much time and effort into putting this amazing conference together. And with that, I am open to questions if anybody has any questions for me or for any of the students in the conference.
Thank you, Erica. I just want to echo that as well. Thank you to all the students and all the panelists who are here this evening, to all the organizations that hosted us when we were in Rome, to Dr. Tavanti and Dr. Perry, everyone else who made this possible. Yeah, if there are any questions, we're happy to field those. But otherwise, we can let everyone have their Wednesday night back.
I just want to say thank you, Erica, for sharing your story. I realized it's a very personal one for you, the trip. And so I just want to share, thank you for being so vulnerable and sharing that. And yeah, thank you to Dr. Tavanti, Dr. Chiara Pieri, and Mariah for keeping us all with keeping the first of all, keeping the class. I was afraid it was going to be canceled. So I'm just glad I got able to meet you guys as our leaders and meet everyone in this class. It's been a wonderful opportunity.
All right, wonderful. I'll go ahead and wrap us up here then. We are recording this session, so we will post it to the website, and we can share that within the class, and then the class can share that with whoever they invited as well, so that people continue to have access to this information and this event. Just want to express another round of thanks to everyone who participated, who helped make this event possible, to everyone who made the trip possible. Dr. Arginal, thank you for being here and for staying. It was a pleasure to meet you and to learn from you. But otherwise, if no one else has anything else, I can go ahead and wrap us up here for the evening. Thank you all for joining us, for participating in this conversation with us. And we hope to be able to impact change after this point, all of us working together, but also to continue to have these discussions with one another. Let's see, I see the chat. Yes, thank you, everybody. But I can go ahead and end this call here. So everyone have a good rest of your evening. To my classmates, I'll see you all later, but everyone else, thank you for joining us and have a good rest of your day. Bye, everyone.